because sometimes I just feel like we're choking on all this information, like this is not that relevant. Hi everyone and welcome back to another video. In today's video I'm going to talk about 2 books in a series, a very recently published series I would say, and that is Dial A for Aunties and Four Aunties and Wedding. I listened to these back to back, so I thought I would just talk about them. I am specifically going to be talking about the audiobook version. I say specifically, other than praising the amazing narrator, I don't have any other comments about the audiobook, but I do think I wouldn't have enjoyed this or have any plans to carry on with this series if I hadn't listened to the audiobook. I definitely think the audiobook adds a layer of like pizzazz to it because of all the accents. But anyway, so this is authored by Jessie Santanto and the narrator is Risa May. And honestly it's good because she just does all the Indo-Chinese accents, so it's brilliant. When I'm talking about one of the second books, so I will say one of the bits where I'm just like, perhaps not so good. Otherwise, like, I thought she was absolutely fantastic, and I think it just really helps to embed you in the culture that Jessie's trying to explain in the book. So as I go through talking about the 2 books, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the book series, I would say, are like contemporary mystery romance books. It's like such a blend. The reason why I particularly was attracted to it was because of the mystery element and because of the element of it being involving POC characters, just characters that I don't really see in these mystery novels. So I was like, oh okay, like I can get on board with this. I'm sure there are more books planned for this series, but at the moment there are only 2. The first book published last year and the second book published this year of March, I believe. I will say if you are planning to read this book, then I would not watch this video because it is going to contain spoilers. So the first one is Dial A for Aunties, and if we set the scene, at the back of the book it does tell you that basically this woman named Medlin, who's our main character, she ends up killing her blind date, and basically it's how her aunties and her mum all come together to help her cover up this blind date whilst they're in the midst of this like really high profile wedding. Medi and her family are Indo-Chinese, and the mum is the florist, Medi is her full name is Medlin, is the photographer, one of her aunts is the baker, I think one of them is a caterer, I could be wrong on that part, and then one of them is a singer. I can't remember what the other one does. Oh, makeup, yeah, so there we go. So there's no caterer. So together they've like formed a business and where they go into weddings. So it's really nice. Straight off like from the blurb, you pretty much know what happens in this entire book, I won't lie. What's good about this book is the unfolding of how all these things happen and how comical it is. So you know that obviously she kills the guy, like, and what they find really difficult is getting rid of the body, and that's just where all the comedy ensues. But also when they're at this hotel, they meet a guy named Nathan, who also happens to be Medi's ex-boyfriend from when she was at college. Someone she never told her mum about, never told her aunts about, anything like that, because she really wanted to keep him from it herself. So part of this book actually does take place like in the past when we're talking about Medi and Nathan together, but honestly it's not really a huge part of the story at all. What is the huge part of the story is how they are going to get rid of this dead body. So essentially when Medi kills this guy by pure accident, he's being a complete creep. I think he's driving her home or something like that, and then basically insinuates that, like, you know, she wants to have sex with him despite the fact that she says no, and then he's like driving her car, so she feels really scared and that he's taking her somewhere, so she tases him. She tases him and then, like, well, yeah, he did. So she just panics and goes home and tells her mum. Her mum calls her aunties, they all come round, and then they decide to stash this guy in like the cooler because one of them is a cake maker. Essentially this cooler ends up getting shipped to this wedding, and this wedding is on like an island near Los Angeles. I don't know LA like that, so I don't know LA at all, so I don't know why I'm saying it like that. So basically the body is now with them, and it's basically them trying to hide this body, and they keep putting it in this cooler and trying to take the cooler off the island, but they can't get the boat back to the island. So then they're just like, how are we going to store this body? It's actually so grim how many times they like are in contact with this body, like it's actually so grim. But actually when they reach the island, they also realise that he wasn't dead the first time, so he had actually tried to claw his way like out of this big chiller or whatever, and then that's like how he actually dies, which was the only part of the story that I actually felt sorry for this guy, because I was like, that's a really horrible death. So all this book really is how they are going to get this dead body out. There are different plans that they come up with to sort of like either blend him in with the crowd, so wild, or like actually just get him off the island. Or how they're going to get rid of his body in general, because obviously like police are going to get involved and things like that. So eventually at one point they end up putting the body in a bed, which I just feel like, well, you know, and when Mehdi, our character, is talking about the fact that, you know, they have to like move him, you can tell how grossed out she is with the whole thing. But alongside of this as well is there's drama happening in the wedding party. So the bride and groom are like some big Indo-Chinese family, and they're coming together to just make more money, because why not? And the groomsman and his, well, the groom and his groomsman, sorry, are all like completely drunk. When the guy goes to take pictures of them, like, yeah, he cannot wake them. So Mehdi's trying to deal with that. Alongside that, there's also some more drama later. Apparently in Indo-Chinese culture, it's common to have like this thing called a tea ceremony, where it's the exchanging of gifts from family, and all those gifts go missing because there's a whole ploy with the bride's, what's the person called, maid of honor, and all that sort of story. And apparently the dead corpse is involved because he was one of the guys that was going to help like finesse and steal all of these things. So there are very convoluted plots running through this. To be not convoluted, there's just loads of plots running through them and they're very easy to follow. So it made the book really entertaining, because whilst you're like, how are they going to get rid of this dead body, there's all these side things happening, and obviously Mehdi runs into Nathan, so they're all having like, oh, these little intimate moments, but then being like, oh yeah, my family don't know about you, and yeah, sorry, I dumped you in a really horrible way. So what I'm describing sounds a bit chaotic, it's because the book is a bit chaotic, but in a really good way. It just was really funny. So alongside the fact that I listened to it as an audiobook, I think that's what made it so funny, because the narrator was able to do all the accents for all the different aunts. And by the way, she named her aunts as like big aunt, like middle aunt, aunt number 4, and all these sorts of things. So in the beginning it's not that easy to follow, but eventually, because there were only like, what, 4 of them essentially, or 3, I can't remember now. It's very easy to follow because their personalities are, whilst they're not that distinct, like because they have certain markers about them, you're able to follow. But she does all the accents like so well, and I think it just really immerses you in the book. It actually reminds me of when I listened to My Sister the Serial Killer. It's the kind of book that if I read it, I wouldn't have like enjoyed it as much, but with the accents and just how the people speak, all those intonations, it just made the book completely. So I did really enjoy this, and like how the mystery gets resolved is by like, well, doesn't really get resolved, but it's just because it's an oath detective, and it was just like all the pieces were in place really nicely, but introduced to this sleep detective quite on. Well, it's not like, yeah, quite early on, and then like he sort of goes away and then comes back later, and you're just like, okay, the personality has, I can see why he made the choices he did. And to be honest, I don't know anyone that would be able to figure out that crime. So that all made sense. And what this book has a really nice way of doing is like making all the little stories make sense and like tying them all up. I didn't ever think, oh, that was tied up really neatly. Like, obviously she ties it up really well, but it didn't feel like too convenient. But I do like that she was able to sort of bring all her storylines together. There was one sort of element between, I mean, Jacqueline the bride and her maid of honor, like I said earlier, and like them, and I was like, okay, it seems a bit twee, but cool. But otherwise, yeah, I thought it was a very nice story. The introduction to her aunts and what they were like was so good, and I thought it was really funny, and you know, you learn a lot about Indo-Chinese culture. Sometimes I think you learn a bit too much, and I don't even think it's too much, it's just a bit like info dumping, and it's just like, I feel like as an author she needs to find a better way of telling us about the culture, rather than just being like, this is what the culture is like. So if we go to the second book, it's essentially a continuation of the first book. And so when I said about Mehdi and Nathan getting back in contact with each other and stuff like that, they managed to like sort out their issues in the end of the book, and Nathan proposes, because the second book is their wedding. Like if you read the back of the book, it would be like Nathan and Mehdi are getting married. So you know, that's not a spoiler there, because you will eventually find out. So the second book is about their wedding, and they decide they're going to get married in Oxford because Nathan's parents are, I think they immigrated to England, whereas Mehdi's family immigrated to America. So whilst they met in college, like Mehdi and Nathan met in college, like I think Nathan's parents now live in England. So one thing I have to say, I don't know why, like this year I've read The Maidens by Alex Michaelis and her. I just feel like, I don't know why authors have such a boner for Oxford Uni. In this case, the author Jessie did go to Oxford Uni, so I can understand that, but I just hate all the fucking descriptions where it's just like, oh my god, so amazing with the shops and the wonderful buildings and all these things, and it's just like, okay, I get people really appreciate that, but I don't know, there's something about it, the elitism of it, that I'm just like, everyone just thinks it's great because it's like so prestige, and you're just like, oh, why do you guys like to write about it in such ways? Like, I don't care. But they decide to get married there, I guess because they have tons of money now. I actually don't know the reason why. Like, Nathan is high up in business, so maybe that's why. And Maddie has actually left the family business. She no longer is like part of the family business, does her own thing. But for the wedding, obviously she doesn't want her family to like do the usual wedding stuff, so do her makeup, do the flowers and stuff like that. So they've gone with an external supplier, which is actually someone her mum and her aunts find. And this is where the chaos ensues. I will say the back of the book of blurb of this one is much less spoilery in terms of what happened, but I'm going to spoil it for you. So again, if you want to read the second book in this, don't watch any further. Essentially, they hire like a wedding provider who is essentially a family like her. It's a girl named Stephanie, who, one of the things like you'll find out in the book, Madeline was meant to be called Madeline, but her parents like misspelled the name. And Stephanie was meant to be Stephanie, but again, apparently this is a common thing in Indo-Chinese culture. So she is the photographer. Her aunt, or her grandma, sorry, is the sort of wedding planner, and then she has like these 3 uncles, and one's a florist, one's a makeup artist. I don't know what the other one does, but yeah, there are 3 uncles. So she's like, oh my god, they're just like us, and like in the run up to the wedding and stuff like that, they become like good friends, and like, you know, the wedding gets planned, and then they go over to the UK, and they're having like Maddie's hen night, and she realises that when, you know, she's left everyone, she's got all these gifts, and Steph has dropped her back to the hotel. So she realises, and she goes to like walk after Steph, and she hears Steph like basically on the call like, yeah, the target is on and all this sort of stuff, and she's just like, what? So she basically confronts Steph, and Steph's like, oh yeah, like we're mafia and we're like planning to take someone out of your wedding, but if you like call off your wedding or don't go ahead with it, we're basically going to tell everyone that you killed Agwon, who is the guy that they killed in the first one. And she's just like, oh no, how does this girl know about Agwon, and oh my god, and all this trouble. So that's where the whole thing basically starts. And so I won't go into depth of what actually happens after that. I feel like this is the sort of thing you need to experience for yourself. But it basically involves aunts being very drunk, aunts being very high on marijuana, trying to drug people, kidnapping people, Maddie being missing for like half her wedding, you know, and like Nathan's parents being really horrible and stuff, but also kind of rightly so pissed off about certain things. It's just very chaotic, it's a lot, and I think that's probably where the downfall comes for me in this book. In the first book, like when we're learning about her aunties and the things they do, it was just funny, like the kind of characters that they were. In the second book, it feels like that is just amplified for comedic effect, so that it doesn't feel that natural. It kind of in a way feels like she's taking the piss out of these aunties. So that, along with the fact that it's just so exaggerated, I was just like, this is so chaotic. It's not terrible, but it's just like, this doesn't feel natural. So yeah, a lot happens, and actually the mystery element to this, I was like, oh, I'm surprised I didn't see it sooner. Like, once someone had said something earlier, once Stephanie, to be fair, had said something earlier, I was like, oh, of course. But yeah, it's well hidden. So I think as a sort of mystery story, it's like kind of well constructed in that sense. It ties up all very nicely, all works together very nicely. I do think for Jessie, like, because of the amount of other plots she has running through the story, I do think she does a really good job of making sure all the plots make sense and like are carried through properly, and they're explained towards the end, so I do like that. And again, because I listened to this one as an audiobook, again it was narrated really well, and I think that just really brought the book to life, that I was able to like understand all these different characters. So that is basically a plot summary of those 2 books. With some sort of points in there and bits I didn't like, but I think just to close, I will just go over sort of like, I guess, 5 things for me that I feel about the series, and like whether or not I'll be continuing with it. I mean, probably not going to get a book until next year anyway. But I will say, I think the reason why I'm really enjoying it and that I will like be continuing on with it is because I'm listening to it via audio. Like I just said there, I just think the audiobook brings the whole series to life. To hear the aunties talking, to hear like how they would say certain things, because there's a word they keep saying in there, I don't know like essentially what that means, but I think if reading it, I would not know. I don't know if there's a glossary in the book or anything like that, but I don't think there is, because most of the words are said in English anyway. But just hearing the intonation in some of these is just like priceless, like, because I've never been exposed to that culture. So for me, like, hearing how they would speak and things like that, I think it just makes it more real. And I also think another reason like why I really enjoyed this series is because it's nice to have a sort of mystery, I guess also contemporary romance novel that focuses on POC characters but from a culture that you don't really see that highly represented. So I like the series for that reason. I think it's really important that there's that sort of balance of who we see literature from, and in this sense, because it's so nice and light-hearted, I think it's also really good to have that sort of mix of like poking fun but at the same time being like, this is how the culture was and how it is traditionally, and this is how like people cope with being immigrants from different countries. I do think she tried to focus on that in the second book, because she does do like a little intro, but it's not that highly touched upon, and to be honest, that makes sense because it's a very light comedic book. Saying that, my third point about this series of books is I completely get she's trying to share Chinese Indo culture with us, but I think she needs to find a better way of integrating it into the book so it doesn't just feel like an info dump. In so many spots, I was literally just like, I just feel like I'm being told about Chinese Indo cultures, that I have to know this, and it doesn't feel natural to what is happening in the story. It's just like she just wants to share these things, and it's just like, I get it. In the sense of like the first book where we were hearing things about the wedding, things like the tea ceremony stuff like made sense, but other times I feel like she perhaps loses her way in how she's trying to share this knowledge with other readers, because sometimes I just feel like we're choking on all this information, like this is not that relevant, or you need to put it into the mouth of someone else. So I do think that is a little bugbear. I like, especially in the second one, I was just like, okay, we get it. This is specific to Chinese Indo culture. Like, it's just completely rammed down your throat, and I just think there's a really subtle way of doing those things where you can get across the beauty of the culture, the how original the culture is, without constantly being in Chinese Indo culture. In Chinese Indo culture, it's just like, okay, we get it now. And speaking of like that fight, the second book that I've just read, one of the qualms I'm having with specifically this book, and so sorry for reference, I didn't say this before, but I gave the first book 3 stars and I gave the second book 2 stars. The books are very over exaggerated. In the first one, I thought it was fine, like it was completely like, it was very funny. In the second one, like I said earlier, I think she's like kind of dragging the aunties like for comedic effect, and it just feels like she's taking the piss out of them, and I don't think it's that funny. But also there are so many elements of the book that are just so over exaggerated, and because Medi's our character, she is like, yeah, she's one of the reasons why she's going to be my 5th point of why I'm just like, but so many elements of this book are just so dramatic, and I'm just like, we need to scale it back a bit. Like, all the crazy things that are happening in the second one, I guess they were wild, but they wouldn't have been as crazy if like it didn't feel like every single chapter they were trying to up the ante on it. It's like, oh well, big aunt did this, now this aunt's doing this, and now this aunt's doing that, and it's just like, can we just bring it down a bit? Like, it just feels like it's getting a bit out of hand, whereas before it was funny, now it just feels like really, really over exaggerated. I'm just like, oh, I hope it doesn't continue down that road, because it just won't be fun anymore. And then yeah, my final point is around Medi. So she is very like, ugh, and I'm just like, why is she like this? To me, Medi reads like she's a 15-year-old girl, and I think she's like in her mid-20s or something like that. I don't know, just the way she talks about things, she's just like, I am literally this, I literally that, and I'm just like, why do you speak like this? Like, it's so weird. But yeah, even like when things are happening with her family, she's just like, oh, like her mum might praise her about something, which, to be fair, her mum was like praising her about something in the midst of her being like, why don't we do this to this person that we've kidnapped? Her mum is like, you're so clever. She's just like, really? My mum thinks I'm clever because of this? And it's just like, how old are you? And I think perhaps that's just, I don't know, I feel like a lot of American TV shows and like American books kind of tend to do this. I think perhaps that's just a bit of like culture difference, I'm gonna say. But yeah, I just don't like it. I just think like, why are you so like, really this, really that? It's just a really annoying personality trait that I don't like in a book. But yeah, she also just is very dramatic in her reaction to certain things, and I'm just like, why? How does that make any sense? Like, if you think your aunts are like really annoying and don't really use their brains that well, why have you come to this conclusion if you're the one that uses your brain really well? It's just like, clearly not. So yeah, those are my thoughts about the book. But it's a good series that I'm enjoying so far. I think the series is titled Aunties, so that's just like what it is. So I'm intrigued to see what the third one could be in the series, because yeah, I don't know what it could possibly be now that we sort of rolled off the end of this one. But it's a good series to sort of get invested in, and it's definitely one that I will keep listening to via audiobook. I just don't have any intention of ever picking up like a physical copy of it. I just don't think the reading experience would be the same. So yeah, that is it for my review. Let me know if you have read this book. I'd be so interested to hear what people from that culture actually think of this book, because like whilst it's not obviously meant to be like the representative of that culture, it's nice that it so heavily features that, and that's clearly what Jessie wanted to highlight in her stories. So yeah, it'd be cool to see like what people who actually have the representation of themselves in this book think. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in another one. Bye.